The service corridor door near the nursery was open by 6 inches. It was never left open. I stopped, hand still on the log tablet, listening. Inside, a porcelain horse lay on its side, one ear snapped clean off. The corridor camera light above the door was dark. I waited, counting breaths, feeling the weight of protocol press against something quieter and more urgent. The corridor outside the nursery held a different temperature than the rest of the West Wing, cooler by design, the air regulated to protect paintings and wood older than the guard himself. And he felt the change on his face as he stopped beside the open door, the 6-inch gap precisely measured by habit rather than sight, his boots aligned with the runner's edge, his shoulder brushing the stone where generations of men like him had stood and not crossed unless ordered. The silence inside broken by a sound too controlled to be accidental, a child's breath caught and held, released in a shallow rhythm that carried fear without volume. And he waited, because waiting was the first rule, because intervention without confirmation ended careers, because the palace rewarded restraint and punished instinct. Yet the porcelain horse on its side inside the room pulled his eyes forward, its broken ear white against the darker carpet, an object from the morning inventory now displaced, evidence of movement that had not been logged. And his gloved hand tightened once before relaxing as he stepped across the threshold, violating the invisible line that separated observation from action. The nursery light dimmed to evening mode, though it was still afternoon, curtains half drawn, a tall figure standing too close to the small chair near the reading table. The child pressed back against the armrest, shoulders tight, hands clenched in her lap, eyes fixed not on the man but on the floor as if instructed to disappear. The guard registering details the way he had been trained, distance, posture, tone. The raised hand paused mid-air, not in motion now, but in implication, a breath held at the top of a command that did not need words. And when the man turned, annoyance crossing his face before recognition, the guard did not speak, did not announce himself, only adjusted his stance so the camera angle would later show him fully inside the room. The child's shoe scuffed against the leg of the chair as she flinched at the movement, and that small sound shifted something from suspicion to certainty. The guard's eyes meeting the man's wrist, where the skin was flushed, the pattern too defined to be accidental contact. And he felt the pressure of lineage settle into the space, the knowledge of who stood before him, what protections followed that name, and how easily this moment could be folded into silence if he chose to step back out, close the door, and write nothing at all. The broken horse waiting to be swept away like a mistake no one admitted. He spoke only to ask if assistance was required, the formal phrasing neutral enough to offer retreat, and the man answered with a sharp denial that carried authority rather than reason, ordering him out with the familiarity of someone unused to challenge. The child's breathing accelerating at the exchange, her fingers whitening as they twisted together. And the guard shifted again, closer now but still measured, placing himself between the raised hand and the small frame without touching either, his presence changing the geometry of the room in a way that could not be ignored. The man's jaw tightening as he lowered his arm, not in concession but calculation, remarking that discipline was a family matter, that correction was necessary, that children tested boundaries, statements delivered like facts meant to close discussion, and the guard acknowledged each with a nod while his eyes tracked the child's posture, the slight tremor in her knee, the red mark visible at the edge of her sleeve where the fabric had ridden up, details that would be denied later if not fixed now in memory. The camera above the bookshelf dormant, its indicator dark, something he noted with a quiet weight because systems did not fail here without notice.
and he asked permission to escort the child to the adjoining sitting room under the pretext of routine, his voice even, his face blank, giving the man space to accept without losing status. But the refusal came fast, sharp, and final, accompanied by a step forward that invaded the child's space again, and the guard reacted not with force, but with placement, his boot sliding half a step, his shoulder angling just enough to block, a movement so small it could be argued as accidental, yet firm enough to stop momentum. The room tightening around them, the air heavy with unspoken consequence. And in that pause, footsteps approached from the corridor, the measured cadence of senior staff, the sound that always arrived before decisions were made for him, the man straightening as authority arrived to reinforce authority, the child shrinking further into the chair, and the guard understood that whatever happened next would be recorded as procedure rather than protection, that the moment to act openly was closing, yet he held his position until instructed otherwise, eyes forward, posture neutral, committing every detail to memory, because memory was the first evidence when records failed. And as the door opened wider and voices filled the space with controlled concern, he felt the rule he had broken settle into something irreversible, not because he had stepped inside the nursery, but because he had seen what stepping back would allow, and that knowledge, once acquired, could not be unlearned.
The senior household secretary entered first, her presence altering the room without raising her voice. Heel stopping just inside the threshold as she took in the arrangement of bodies, the child in the chair, the man standing, the guard positioned between them, and she registered the imbalance immediately, even as her expression remained composed, asking what had occurred in a tone that assumed an answer already prepared, the man supplying it smoothly, framing the moment as a misunderstanding, a corrective conversation exaggerated by sensitivity, his words practiced, his hands now calm at his sides, and the guard noted how the explanation omitted the broken toy, the flushed wrist, the inactive camera, omissions often carrying more weight than lies, yet protocol bound him to silence unless directly addressed, and so he stood, hands clasped behind his back, eyes forward, absorbing the quiet pressure radiating from the secretary as she turned to the child, lowering herself slightly to appear gentle, asking if she was hurt, the question delivered softly but without waiting for a reply, her attention already shifting to the logistics of removal, instructing an aide to escort the child to the east sitting room, mentioning tea and rest as if the matter were resolved, the child hesitating, eyes flicking toward the guard for a fraction of a second before dropping again, a glance that lasted less than a breath but anchored itself in him, and he felt the weight of it settle against the rules drilled into him, the instruction not to interfere in family matters, the hierarchy that placed him beneath everyone now speaking, the aide reaching for the child's hand, pausing when the guard cleared his throat once, a sound barely audible yet deliberate, drawing the secretary's attention, and when she looked at him he met her eyes evenly, requesting with formal precision that medical staff assess the child before movement, citing procedure for any incident involving distress, the words chosen carefully, non-accusatory, anchored in policy rather than judgment, the room stilling as the request reframed the narrative, the man's expression tightening again, the secretary holding the pause just long enough to measure the cost of refusal, then declining with equal calm, stating that no incident had been logged, therefore no assessment was required, her authority absolute, her tone closing the matter, and she instructed the guard to stand down and resume corridor duty, the phrase delivered without hostility but with finality, the kind that carried consequences if tested, and he acknowledged the order with a nod, stepping back half a pace as trained, the aide guiding the child away, her steps light, almost soundless on the carpet, and as she passed the guard her sleeve slipped again, the mark more visible now, and he fixed it in memory,
knowing that once she left the room the environment would reset, objects replaced, explanations refined, and that his silence would become part of the record unless he found a way to break it without breaking himself. He returned to the corridor position as instructed, the door closing softly behind him, muting the voices inside, the palace resuming its controlled rhythm as if nothing had shifted, and he stood at attention while the secretary spoke quietly to the man within, their tones indistinct but measured, the guard focusing on the camera housing above him, noting the maintenance seal intact despite the feed being dark, another inconsistency to add to the growing list he carried internally. The aide passing with the child moments later, the girl wrapped now in a light shawl despite the warm interior, her face composed in the way children learned early here, her eyes forward, and she did not look at him again, which he understood not as indifference but instruction. And the secretary followed, stopping briefly beside him to remind him that discretion protected everyone, that his professionalism was valued, that moments like this required trust in established authority. Her words delivered kindly, almost reassuringly, yet beneath them lay the warning, unspoken but clear, that deviation would be noticed, and he acknowledged again, the exchange outwardly complete, inwardly unresolved, and when the corridor emptied he resumed his log, recording the time, the routine movement, the non-event as it would be read later, his fingers steady as he entered the standard phrasing, the absence of any mention of the broken toy, the raised hand, the mark on skin, each omission a deliberate compliance that tightened something in his chest, the air cool and faintly scented with polish, the sounds distant, controlled, and as the shift continued he felt pressure not as fear but as narrowing options, understanding that authority here did not shout or threaten, it smoothed edges, absorbed resistance, made dissent appear unnecessary, and that any challenge would have to be precise, documented, and timed, not emotional, not reactive, because reaction would be dismissed as misunderstanding. And when his relief arrived hours later, exchanging brief nods as always, the guard carried the day with him, replaying details not as doubt but as preparation, knowing that protocol had been used not to protect a child but to protect the absence of a record, and that the choice before him was no longer whether to act but how to do so without becoming another silent corridor, another closed door measured to 6 inches and ignored.
The night shift brought a quieter palace, the kind of quiet that exposed systems rather than soothing them, and the guard used it to listen, to watch patterns settle into their true shapes as staff numbers thinned and movement became purposeful instead of ceremonial. His route unchanged, yet his attention sharpened, eyes returning to the camera junction outside the nursery corridor where the indicator had remained dark longer than a routine reset would allow, and he logged a maintenance query through the internal channel reserved for infrastructure faults, wording it clinically, attaching timestamps, knowing that technical language traveled farther than moral concern. And when the response came delayed and incomplete, citing scheduled work that did not exist on the master calendar, he copied the exchange to his personal secure notes, a habit not encouraged but not forbidden, each entry time-stamped, neutral, factual, the kind of record that survived scrutiny. And he cross-checked the access logs for the West Wing during the afternoon window, finding a gap where the camera corridor should have populated entries automatically, a blank space that stood out more than any anomaly, because the system was designed to fail visibly, alarms, alerts, redundancies layered to prevent silence, and yet silence was exactly what had occurred, and he marked it without commentary, then requested the duty roster for aides assigned to the nursery that day, noting one name that appeared twice under different supervisors, a clerical impossibility suggesting after-the-fact adjustment, and he did not confront anyone, did not ask questions that could be deflected, instead observing the flow of authority like water finding its level, understanding that pressure here moved sideways before it moved up. And when he encountered the aide later,
the one who had escorted the child, he kept the interaction routine, exchanging required confirmations, noting the way she avoided eye contact without appearing evasive, her hands steady, her posture correct, a professional mask worn too tightly. And he offered nothing beyond a standard courtesy, allowing her the dignity of silence, because witnesses here spoke only when silence became more dangerous than speech. And as the hours passed, he assembled a sequence rather than a story. No accusations, no conclusions, just the order of events stripped to structure, the missing feed, the altered roster, the removal without assessment. And he prepared to escalate not to command, but to the internal protection channel designed for external threats, the irony not lost on him, because misuse of authority had never been listed as an internal danger worth formal naming. And he initiated the process with care, selecting the category that would trigger review without alerting household leadership, attaching documents without narrative, letting the evidence speak in its own quiet way. And as he submitted the packet, he felt the first true resistance, not external but internal, the knowledge that once initiated, the process would move independently, that he could not control who touched it or how it would be interpreted, and that retreat afterward would not restore neutrality. And he paused with his finger resting on the confirmation, the palace humming softly around him, the lights dimmed, the air steady, and pressed down. The confirmation returned almost immediately, automated, impersonal, yet its arrival marked a shift he could feel in the way the palace responded to him. Subtle delays at checkpoints, a second glance from a supervisor who had never needed to look twice, the recalibration of proximity that occurred when someone was quietly reclassified from background to variable. And he adjusted accordingly, maintaining precision, giving no one cause to question his performance, understanding that scrutiny fed from deviation. And within hours the channel requested additional clarification, a narrow query about the inactive camera that suggested the issue had been routed to technical audit rather than dismissed, and he supplied only what was asked, resisting the urge to explain context, because context invited interpretation, and interpretation invited dilution. And he returned to duty with the awareness that the child remained unassessed, her whereabouts known but her condition officially unremarkable. And he noted increased presence around the east wing, guards reassigned under the guise of routine rotation, authority circling its perimeter instinctively. And when he encountered the senior household secretary again, she addressed him as usual, tone unchanged, yet the conversation included a casual reference to loyalty, to the value of cohesion in times of external pressure, statements designed to frame the environment rather than accuse, and he accepted them without comment, knowing that denial was unnecessary when the system preferred compliance. And later, alone in the control room during a scheduled handover, he observed a junior technician hesitating over the camera feed restoration, the work order flagged for approval beyond his clearance, a delay that had nothing to do with equipment and everything to do with caution. And the guard did not intervene, did not advise, allowing the friction to remain visible, because friction generated questions, and questions traveled upward faster than complaints. And as dawn approached, the palace shifted again, a controlled alert moving through internal channels that an unscheduled departure was being prepared, a vehicle request filed with protective detail attached, the name associated with it familiar, the timing conspicuous. And the guard understood that authority, when threatened, chose motion over explanation, relocation over resolution. And he checked the protocol governing such departures, noting clauses about safeguarding considerations that were rarely invoked, clauses that required a specific condition to be met. And he prepared himself not for confrontation, but for presence, adjusting his kit, reviewing the language of lawful intervention, the thresholds that transformed instinct into duty. and as the first light touched the stone outside, pale and cold, he felt the narrowing path ahead clarify into something precise, a line he would be required to stand on without stepping beyond it, because whatever happened next would determine whether the system corrected itself or closed ranks completely, and he intended, quietly, to make sure it could not do the latter unnoticed.
The departure request moved through the system with practiced efficiency, the kind that suggested familiarity rather than urgency, and the guard received the reassignment order without explanation, a simple adjustment placing him on exterior escort rotation near the north courtyard, where vehicles staged before exit, the morning air sharp against the skin, stone holding the night's cold as staff took positions with minimal conversation, each aware that routine departures did not usually require this density of presence, and he noted the composition of the protective detail, experienced, disciplined, chosen for discretion rather than force, their posture relaxed but alert, eyes scanning patterns they already knew by heart. And he took his place where sight lines converged, neither obstructing nor yielding, the courtyard filling with the low mechanical sounds of preparation, doors opening, radios murmuring, the vehicle idling just beyond the archway. And when the man emerged flanked by aides, coat already on despite the mild weather, his stride purposeful, the guard observed the absence that mattered most, the child not present, no accompanying note logged to explain her separation from the departure, a deviation from custom subtle enough to pass unnoticed by those not looking for it. And he checked the authorization packet again, confirming that safeguarding clearance had not been appended, the clause unmet, the departure technically compliant, yet ethically hollow, and he stepped forward at the precise moment when protocol allowed inquiry, addressing the lead escort with a neutral request for confirmation of clearance status, his tone level, his body language open, forcing the conversation into the open without accusation, the lead escort glancing toward the aides, receiving a slight nod that carried dismissal rather than instruction, and responding that all requirements had been met. And the guard accepted the words while noting the lack of reference number, the omission small but telling, and he adjusted his stance again, aligning himself with the vehicle's path in a way that did not block it but required acknowledgement. And when the man noticed him fully for the first time since the nursery, irritation flashing briefly before being contained, he issued a direct order to stand aside, voice low, controlled, assuming obedience as a given. And the guard did not argue, did not raise his voice, only asked for the safeguarding officer's sign-off as required under exceptional movement, citing the exact section by number, his memory precise, his delivery unembellished, and the courtyard stilled, the aides exchanging looks, the lead escort hesitating just long enough to register uncertainty, and in that hesitation the guard felt the shift from observation to action, not dramatic, not loud, but definitive, the moment when silence could no longer be framed as professionalism. And when the man attempted to bypass him physically, shoulder angling toward the vehicle door, the guard responded with trained economy, stepping in to redirect rather than restrain, his hand placed at the forearm, pressure applied with precision, enough to stop forward movement without escalation, the contact brief but undeniable, and the sound of boots adjusting echoed off the stone as the protective detail reacted instinctively, weapons untouched, bodies repositioning, the guard's focus narrowing to breath control and alignment, aware that any excess would be recorded as aggression, any retreat as failure, and he held the line, eyes steady, voice calm, stating only that departure was suspended pending safeguarding clearance. The seconds that followed stretched not with chaos but with calculation,
authority weighing options in real time, the aides recalibrating narratives, the protective detail holding position as trained, and the guard maintained contact only as long as necessary, releasing the arm once the forward motion ceased, stepping back half a pace to signal restraint rather than dominance, and the man's face flushed, not with pain, but with affront, his authority challenged not by rhetoric, but by procedure, and he demanded names, consequences, invoked hierarchy without raising his voice, the kind of controlled pressure designed to fracture resolve. And the guard acknowledged each statement with a nod, offering his identification as required, not volunteering justification, because justification would imply uncertainty. And the lead escort finally intervened, clarifying through command channels, his tone professional, his eyes careful, and the delay that followed became irreversible, radios activating, queries escalating beyond household control, the safeguarding clause now triggered by the very act of dispute. And within minutes, senior security oversight was notified, their arrival marked not by sirens or spectacle, but by additional presence, coats, badges, the quiet authority of people whose mandate was narrower but deeper. And the man attempted one final assertion, stepping toward the vehicle again, and the guard mirrored him, not touching this time, simply occupying space with intent, his posture communicating that movement would be met, and the protective detail recognized the line had shifted, adjusting to protect all parties rather than expedite departure. And when the oversight officer arrived, briefcase in hand, eyes taking in the scene without commentary, the guard provided his report in clipped, factual sentences, sequence over sentiment, evidence referenced without interpretation, and the oversight officer listened, asked one clarifying question about the camera outage, and nodded, enough to formalize the intervention, and the departure was officially suspended, recorded as a safeguarding review rather than a disciplinary action, the language precise, the consequences unfolding slowly but inexorably, and the man was escorted back inside under the same calm that had brought him out, his authority intact on paper but constrained in practice, and the guard stepped away once relieved, hands steady, breath controlled, aware that the physical act had been the smallest part of what he had done, and that the real force applied was procedural, the use of the system's own weight to prevent itself from closing ranks. And as the courtyard emptied and routine resumed around the interruption, he felt not triumph but a narrowing quiet, the understanding that from this point forward his role would be scrutinized through a different lens, that isolation would follow not as punishment but as caution, and that the child's safety, though temporarily secured, would now depend on processes that moved slowly and remembered everything. And he accepted that without ceremony, returning to his post with the same measured steps, the stone already warming under the rising sun, the palace absorbing the disturbance without visible crack, yet altered in ways that could not be undone.
The safeguarding review unfolded without spectacle. Its presence felt more in absence than activity. Doors closed that had once remained open. Meetings held off the main corridors. Language tightening across internal briefings as staff adjusted to a process that did not belong to any single authority. And the guard returned to standard rotation under the designation of availability, not reassigned, not promoted, simply moved to the edges where observation replaced engagement. His days marked by longer stretches of stillness, fewer direct exchanges, the palace continuing its rhythms while subtly rerouting around him. And he noticed how questions that once came freely now traveled past him, how glances paused then moved on, professional courtesy intact but thinned. And through official channels he received confirmation that the child had been placed under protective oversight, medical assessment conducted privately, findings sealed, the phrasing careful, the details minimal,
yet the outcome sufficient to justify the intervention retroactively. And he acknowledged the notice without response, understanding that acknowledgment itself was now part of the record. And he observed increased supervision around the child's routines from a distance, additional staff assigned under neutral titles, movement patterns adjusted, not enough to draw attention, but enough to create buffer. And the man at the center of the review remained present in the palace, yet constrained, his movements logged, his authority intact in ceremony, but limited in reach. The kind of containment designed to preserve appearance while preventing recurrence. And the guard felt the strain of holding knowledge that could not be shared, the awareness that truth here existed in fragments distributed across systems, no single person holding it whole, and that this fragmentation was by design. And as days passed without incident, without acknowledgment of his role beyond procedural notes, he accepted the emerging shape of his position, not punished, not praised, simply set apart. And in the quiet hours he replayed the moment in the courtyard, not with doubt, but with calibration, confirming to himself that each action had remained within the narrow corridor of lawful duty, that instinct had been translated into protocol rather than allowed to override it, and that this translation was the only reason the outcome stood, because emotion here dissolved under scrutiny while process endured. And he continued his work with the same precision, the same attention to small details, aware that his margin for error had narrowed, that any deviation now would be interpreted through a lens already adjusted.